and she's also a marine naturalist researcher. Please welcome Sandra Pollard.
Thank you all for being here today, and thank you for inviting me to come. And I was asked if I would mention why I wrote this book, and the reason I wrote it was because I could see this information slipping away and never being retrieved. I don't know how many people here have been to the Cookville Wharf on Whidbey Island. There are some very graphic photos there of the 1970 Pen Cove capture, in which you can see the mothers being separated from their calves. And I remember the first time I saw that photo, and I couldn't take it in. I was shocked. I couldn't believe that this had actually happened. So I decided I wanted to research it because it just didn't make sense to me. And when I was asked to mention some salient points that I had come across, to be honest, there were so many. It was just one long thread, one long revelation of what happened here in Washington State to so many of our whales. And we're not too far now from Pier 56, which is where a lot of this started from. The capture era here took place from 1965 to 1976. There was the first capture of a southern resident, Moby Doll, in 1964 up in Canada, and Moby Doll was a J-pod whale. But two men were the perpetrators here, Donald Goldsberry and Ted Griffin. And they captured most of the whales here in Washington State, starting in 1965. Griffin brought down a northern resident whale called Namu to the Seattle Marine Aquarium, which he had started in 1962 in conjunction with the World's Fair. And here he kept Namu for a year, and he then decided he'd like a companion for Namu. So together with Goldsberry, he went off on the hunt for whales. At that particular time, they would use a harpoon gun from a helicopter, and also tranquilize the whales as well, tranquilizer darts. And as usual, they would use fast boats to herd them. And they came across a pod of orcas, and they harpooned the mother, and they took the calf. And that calf was Shamu, SeaWorld's name for every performing orca there. And Shamu survived until 1971. But during that time, up until 1970, they continued to capture whales in Puget Sound. And what I discovered, because I hadn't been able to understand how they could be able to do this, was there was no law against it. As long as you had a netting license from the Department of Fisheries and the necessary resources of money and boats, you could go out and capture whales. So they refined their methods to purse seining, which is the very large nets that they catch salmon in, and this is what they used to capture the whales. And they would then bring them back here to the Seattle Marine Aquarium, and they would be kept here until they found a buyer. Now, that wasn't normally too difficult. There were buyers waiting for them around the world. And their torture really started, as Melissa mentioned, with the captures. Captures are brutal. They use seal bombs to disorient and frighten the whales, and noise travels much faster and louder underwater. And when they brought them back to the Seattle Marine Aquarium, that would be done by hoisting the whales in a sling from the water and then down onto a flatbed truck. And then that truck would be taken either across the ferry from Whidbey Island, and certainly they did that, or down along the roads, obviously. And they would be here, and the first thing that they did with whales was to give them injections to offset the physiological shock they had received. Anyway, they get antibiotics for 7 days, and that was to offset the many cuts and myriad of scrapes that they had sustained during the capture process. And then it would all start again. They would have to be hoisted by sling and crane onto a flatbed truck and then taken to the airport to delivered to places around the world. And we're never really going to know the number of southern residents that we lost. We take the number 45 to 50, but we don't really know. I was able to trace the southern residents that we knew to be southern residents because I used Eric Hoyt's book as a database, and that was an excellent start. But many of the whales at the Seattle Marine Aquarium we know also drowned. I talked to someone last year who was what he described himself as a whale walker, and he was a student and getting some extra money, and he was asked to help to keep the whales upright because when they were disoriented they would turn over, roll over and drown, and many of them had drowned. And records were kept of the number of captures, etc., but really how honest they were, I think, is but in 1970, as we've already mentioned, there was the big 1970, the big capture in Pen Cove on Whidbey Island, and that is where the last surviving resident, Lolita, was taken from. Now, because of the hue and cry from that 1970 capture, in 1971, Washington State brought in a law. But what it did was to give Griffin and Goldsborough had to get permits for captures, and they then had to pay $1,000 per whale caught, and they would only be allowed to capture so many, maybe 4 or even 6. In 1972, the Marine Mammal Protection Act came in, and the state law was then taken over by the federal law. And in 1973, SeaWorld applied for a permit, and they got it. In 1976, the last capture took place here in Washington State, in Bud Inlet, Olympia, right under the nose of the former Secretary of State, Ralph Munro. And as with all the captures, it was equally brutal. Goldsborough drove 6 transient orca, those are the orcas that eat marine mammals, the southern residents are fish eaters, drove the transient orca into Bud Inlet using seal bombs, the usual way they would try and frighten and disorient the whales, and he was incensed by what he saw. The governor was out of state, but he had permission to get a lawsuit underway, and within 2 weeks there was no more SeaWorld in Washington State. But the damage was done. We lost almost probably a third of the southern resident population. And as David said, they have never recovered. It was one of the reasons given in 2005 by National Marine Fisheries Service for listing the orcas as endangered because the population dynamics had been so upset by these captures. And I would just like to read one very short piece here. And we're thinking today of all the dolphins, all the whales in captivity. And we think especially at this point in time because it is so imminent of the potential for Lolita's release. And what I'm going to read here is a little piece from the book, which is self-explanatory. The last helpless victim to be taken away to a new life far removed from her family was Lolita, also known as Tokite, the only surviving southern resident still alive in captivity. Pixie Mailer, a resident of Oak Harbor, recounted, "There was a bunch of us who went down every day, and it's the worst thing that I've ever seen in my life. It should never have happened. The whales cried. We watched them load them and saw them specifically load a small one in the back of a truck. I think it was probably Lolita, and she cried and cried and cried the whole way. It's a sound you don't forget, you just don't. I'll never forget it. And that stays with me whenever I think of Lolita, whenever I look out at the mountains and see the beauty surrounding us and the cruelty that has happened here. And as Chief Seattle said, what is a man without the beasts? Before the beasts were gone, man would die from a great loneliness of spirit. For whatever happens to the beast soon happens to the man. All things are connected. Thank you.